Okay, I have with me today Dr. Waney Squier. I'm sure that she will be known to many of you. Um, she's going to explain her full background, and we're going to talk about everything that's happened to her that is, I'd say, fairly infamous by now. For those who don't know, she was instrumentally involved in shaken baby syndrome and challenging this diagnosis in court. But before we get into all of that, I'll just say hello to Waney, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
That's my pleasure. Can I just point out to viewers how well color coordinated we are today? This wasn't planned. This wasn't planned. It's just a happy
Even
coincidence.
down to the dog hair.
Even down to dog hair on our jumpers. Yeah. I mean, I tried to keep Kiko down, but she just wasn't keen on the idea, so she had to crawl away from me to start. So yeah. Before we go into the court cases you've been involved with, the background of shaken baby syndrome, which we're going to discuss, could you start by telling us about your background and your history of working in neuropathology?
Yes, well, I qualified in medicine. I didn't entirely want to do medicine. When I got my A levels, I just was interested in how things happen. I love biology, wanted to know how things work. And I had an elder brother who said, no, do medicine because you'll get a much better range of career prospects. And I said, but I don't think I want to be doing the things that doctors do. You know, anyway, he persuaded me. I went to medical school. I loved it. I had a wonderful time. And afterwards, I wanted to do pediatrics. So I did a couple of years of pediatrics. I took all the exams, and those days, you took your exams at the beginning of your training. So I was completely qualified to start a formal training in pediatrics. But then I realized I didn't actually like the front line. It was too frightening. I didn't like seeing sick, injured children, um, feeling of helplessness quite often, couldn't do anything for them. Um, anyway, it became clear to me that pathology was going to be my best outcome from this. And I've never regretted going into pathology. I had a fabulous career. I was fortunate enough to be able to specialize in neuropathology, which is examining the brain, and specifically to go into pediatric neuropathology. And I was one of the first people in this country who actually wanted to study the brains of infants. At the time, people would look at me and say, "Why do you want to do that?" I mean, why would you want to look at a fetal brain? It's not even a human being. It was astonishing, but
Hmm.
it was so fascinating to see how the brain developed, to see what would happen if something happened in a pregnancy, how you could identify when it had happened because of the state of development of the brain at the time. And this, of course, was incredibly helpful when looking at brain scans of children who have things like epilepsy and cerebral palsy, because you can look at the scan and say, oh, this is clearly something that happened way before birth, 20 weeks of gestation or 12 weeks or something like that.
Hmm.
So it was remarkably interesting, absolutely fascinating, and a very, very satisfying career. And I spent, well, nearly 40 years looking at the brains of infants and babies who had died.
Yeah. So that's obviously excellent credential that you have to begin with. So then, at some point in your life, you begin working in the court system. So can you tell me how that came about initially?
Yes, I suppose the first time I went to court was really about babies who'd suffered from birth injuries because of my history of looking at the brain and understanding how the brain develops and what can damage it when. I was able to apply this in looking at cases of children who were thought to have suffered injury at birth. And these were medical negligence cases where obstetricians, for example, were being challenged for a child's disorder and damage. And so I gave evidence in cases like that and was sometimes able to say, well, it's quite clear that this happened halfway through pregnancy. It's nothing to do with whatever happened at birth, which was a great relief to obstetricians, obviously. Sometimes it wasn't that easy, and sometimes one had to say, no, this could have been at birth. But anyway, that's how I got into doing cases in court. And then as time went on, I was looking at all the baby brain cases in Oxford, and some from the regions around Oxford would get sent to me. And inevitably, some came along where the question was whether this was child abuse. Would I give evidence? So I started giving evidence in the courts on babies who died suddenly and unexpectedly, where it was thought the cause may not have been natural.
Yeah. So you did appear in the prosecution of shaken baby cases originally, and then you essentially you completely changed your mind on the science behind this. So I guess I should explain, or maybe better for you to explain what shaken baby syndrome is before we go any further, actually.
Yes, shaken baby syndrome is essentially a hypothesis that was generated in the 1970s because doctors couldn't understand why it was that some of these young babies, usually 3 months old or less, would come to hospital, sometimes very ill, sometimes not very ill, but showing evidence of bleeding around the brain in the membranes that surround the brain inside the skull, bleeding behind the eyes in the retina, and what's called encephalopathy, which can be, well, it's sort of brain malfunction. It can be a baby who's not sleep or is rather sleepy, not feeding well, vomiting, or a baby who's really severely ill and has massive brain swelling. And these are signs that had traditionally been associated with trauma. But the mystery about these cases, they never had any evidence of trauma. They didn't have fractures, they didn't have bruises, they didn't have anything to indicate that they'd had a major um, accident or injury. And it was a British neurosurgeon who said in the 70s, well, maybe if you shook a baby, you would be able to damage it without causing any direct injury. And that could cause these symptoms. And it was a suggestion by somebody called Norman Guthkelch that this could be a possibility. And it was seized upon to explain these cases that doctors found it very hard to explain otherwise. And it just became accepted as a reasonable hypothesis, a reasonable diagnosis for these babies. Um, it was accepted into the medical literature, into the textbooks taught in medical schools. And I was one of the people who read all about this and thought, okay, right, this is shaken baby syndrome. And in fact, I did do a number of cases where a child died after being brought into hospital suddenly unwell. And the pathologist would say, well, there's bleeding around the brain and there's bleeding behind the eyes. We think this is shaken baby syndrome. I would look at the brain, and if I didn't find anything else, any other obvious problem with the brain, then that would fit with shaken baby syndrome because often the brain's just a bit swollen or there's not very much to see. And I went along with this. And it wasn't until about the year 2000 that one of my colleagues, Jenny Geddes, a neuropathologist in London, wrote a paper in which she had studied 50 babies who died suddenly and unexpectedly and were thought to have been the victims of inflicted injury. And she found that, in fact, these babies didn't have trauma, they didn't have tearing of the nerve fibers in the brain, as you would expect in traumatic injury, but they had brain swelling. And that can be seen in a huge number of conditions. They specifically had lack of oxygen to the brain and swelling, which could have been due to the heart failing or due to choking or due to some lung problem. All sorts of things. Certainly didn't mean it had to be trauma. And I had huge respect for Jenny Geddes and her work. She was a very senior member of our neuropathology community. And so I talked to her and I read her papers and I thought what she was saying sounded reasonable. So I started reading, looking at all the literature I could, talking to lots of people. I met somebody called John Plunkett in the United States, who was a forerunner in the field challenging shaken baby syndrome. And I realized, yeah, there's no evidence to support this shaken baby hypothesis. And when I looked at my own experience looking at thousands of babies' brains, it became obvious that these three findings that were thought to be typical of a shaking injury are in fact just things that happen in the newborn brain, because the newborn brain is very different from the adult brain. It's going to grow, put on 3 or 4 times its weight in the first year of life. The skull's got to grow. There's got to be a lot of accommodation for this growing metabolically active brain to have a huge blood supply. And that's why when something happens, when a baby suffers from lack of oxygen, you can have bleeding around the brain and bleeding behind the eyes and brain swelling, all of these being interrelated. They're because something's going wrong with the blood supply and the normal situation in the skull, in the brain. And these three things happen together. So they're not just three random findings, they're closely interrelated physiological responses in the infant brain. And it's different from the adult brain. So it, of course, made sense to me that we'd been making a mistake all the way along and suggesting it was trauma when there was no evidence to suggest it must be trauma. There were plenty of natural causes for these three findings to happen together.
Yeah. Now, we're going to get more into the science of this as we continue with the interview, but I just want to contextualize this for viewers first. So I was speaking to you about this before today, and I was telling you that I told a friend of mine that you can go through the traumatic experience of losing a child, which is already one of the worst things that could ever happen to you. And then instead of being counseled for your enormous loss and almost inevitable psychological difficulties, instead you're in a police station, then potentially you're in court, and then you're either in prison or your child's taken off you forever, or both. And that is what happens, isn't it?
It happens again and again and again. I have so many cases. Some of these families I've got to know really well and seen just how this damages them, how some of these people are really, they're wrecked. They're shadows of their former selves because of what they've been through, because there can be nothing worse than losing a baby and then being told that you killed it. I mean, it's just unthinkable. It's awful.
Yeah. So at the heart, as you mentioned, there's a triad of conditions at the heart of this theory. Let's call it a theory. Subdural hemorrhage, retinal hemorrhage, and encephalopathy, I think it's pronounced
Mhm.
correctly. Could you just quickly walk us through those, what is meant by those terms? I think you touched upon it already, but if you could just clarify that for us, please.
Okay, the brain is surrounded by three membranes. It's a very tough, fibrous membrane that lines the bony skull. And that contains some very big channels that take blood from the brain back to the heart. There's a huge volume of blood going through the brain, especially the baby brain, in proportion to the rest of the body. It's a huge amount of the cardiac output goes through the brain and into these channels back to the heart. So the dura, which is the name of this membrane, has a very big supply, particularly of veins, which are returning blood back to the heart. Underneath the dura is another membrane called the arachnoid membrane, which is essentially a sac containing fluid, which the brain is buoyant in. It protects the brain because it's a nice sac of fluid around the brain, so that in times of trauma or whatever movement, the brain is protected from damage. And then the inner one is the pial membrane, which is a very fine membrane lining the surface of the brain. And what happens in subdural hemorrhage is bleeding occurs actually from the dura, but it creeps out underneath it between the dura and the next membrane, the arachnoid, and there it is called a subdural hemorrhage. But in fact, we know from anatomical studies that it always starts within the dura. It's intradural hemorrhage, which then leaks and becomes this film of blood over the surface of the brain. So that's subdural hemorrhage. The other one is retinal hemorrhage, which occurs in the lining of the back of the eye. Now, the eye, of course, this is brain out on a stalk, grows out of the brain and comes forward to fill the eye socket. So the lining of the eye, the retina, is a bit of brain tissue, which is on a stalk. And it's one part of the brain that we can look at with an ophthalmoscope, and we can actually see how the brain is functioning by looking at, well, not exactly see how the brain is functioning. We get some reflections of what's going on inside the head by looking at that bit of nervous tissue in the retina. Now, if the brain swells or blood can't get into the brain because it's very swollen. It can't get from the arteries into the cranial cavity. It's diverted, and it's frequently diverted to the eyes. So in that condition, you get more bleeding going through the eyes, more blood flowing through the eyes, and more potential for bleeding. And also, the venous return, the blood coming back from the eyes, can't get into the skull because of the raised pressure. So that promotes bleeding. So bleeding in the retina is very commonly associated with subdural bleeding and with raised pressure inside the head. So those are those two parts of it. And the third part is encephalopathy, which, as I said, can be anything from just a mildly irritable baby to a really severely ill baby with massive brain swelling. So encephalopathy really usually implies brain swelling, but clinically it can have a range of manifestations.
Sure. And you say that this triad does not reliably prove abuse. So can you explain why?
Yes, because this triad of findings are findings seen in the immature brain. It's just the physiology of the immature brain that if the brain swells, if it suffers from lack of oxygen, if it suffers trauma, all of these things can happen. So you get the three of them happening together. And most interestingly, perhaps, is that in the newborn baby, about 50% of normal healthy newborn babies have retinal hemorrhage, and about 50% have subdural hemorrhage. And then if you think about newborn babies who don't want to feed and they're a bit sleepy for the first 24 hours and just leave me alone, that could be classed as encephalopathy. If that baby was a few weeks older, baby would have the triad. So certainly two and possibly three of the features of the triad are actually normal in normal, healthy newborn babies because this is part of the infant's brain's pathophysiology.
Yeah.
So a variety of things can also cause the triad, including being a normal newborn baby.
That's very clear. So in preparation for this interview, you sent me several papers that I've read and tried to understand. And one of the things that you cited was, or one of them cited, was a kind of comparison between biomechanical evidence related to shaking and dropping. So could you kind of walk us through what that evidence tells us?
Yes, it's quite remarkable, but the first sort of mention of shaken baby syndrome and its first appearance in public was the very early 70s. And it was something like 13 years before anybody decided to do any research to see if it was real, if we could do research to prove that the triad was indicative of inflicted injury or shaking. And one of the first research projects looked at babies who died, they looked at the pathology, and then they made models of babies like these crash test dummies, a little model, a mannequin of a baby of 6 months of age. And they got people grown up volunteers to come in and shake these models and then to smack them down onto, or drop them or smack them onto a hard surface. And they found that the shaking produced about 1/50th of the acceleration that an impact can cause. And that's even a fall from 1 foot can cause more acceleration than the maximum shaking that an adult can impose on a baby. So this really blew the whole thing out of the water in 1987. And the author of that paper wrote at the end, it seems that shaking alone can't cause shaken baby syndrome, and it's really not a good name. But maybe what happened in her conclusion, she said, maybe what happens is that somebody will shake a baby and then throw it into the cot in a fit of anger or irritation or frustration, and that's what causes the damage. Now, this was something which they hadn't done the research on. The research showed shaking would not cause these injuries, but she said, well, maybe just throwing it into the cot could, and the cot being soft would prevent any bruising. And that caught on, and people grabbed that and ran with it and talked about shaken impact syndrome, and then dropped the impact bit,
mm,
but accepted. And I mean, even the last year or so, I've heard people in court saying, "Oh well, yes, we think it's a sudden fit of temper, and the parent just shakes the baby and throws it into the cot."
mm,
No evidence at all. A simple hypothesis at the end of a paper,
mm.
following a paper which showed that shaking can't cause these injuries, but that wasn't taken on board. It was the pure speculation that was taken on board and thought to indicate that shaken baby syndrome is real.
So, I mean, that's from my perspective, that's just really hard to understand. So why do you think that happened, or do you know why that happened?
Why people just accepted it?
Yeah,
Well,
well, why was it taken on board in that way? I mean, is there a vested interest? Is it just a lack of understanding? Why,
yeah,
why
I
would that
mean,
be forwarded so much?
well, a lot of things. One is that most doctors want to protect infants. We all want to protect infants. Nobody can bear the thought of a weak, innocent little child being beaten up. I mean, it's just a horrible thought. So a lot of doctors are very motivated by child protection. They want to prevent any injury happening to infants, and they want to shelter them and take them away from frightening and damaging environments. And of course, that's very worthy thinking. Um, then there are people, I think, who have said, well, we've been diagnosing shaken baby syndrome for many years, and we couldn't possibly be wrong. We don't like to be wrong. We don't want to be wrong. So I think there are people who dug their heels in because a lot of doctors don't like to say they don't know or that they're wrong.
Yeah,
And I certainly think that many doctors who do this kind of work, I mean, they look at hundreds or thousands of cases. And if they were to wake up in the wee small hours and think, what if I'm wrong? What if I did get it wrong and I've broken up all of these families? I put all these people in prison and I'm wrong. It must be very hard to take that on board. And I think there are some people who can just bury that and say, not even going to go there, just carry on doing what I'm doing. And then there are those who make a lot of money doing what they're doing. And there was recently an expose in I think it was in the Telegraph, saying that it's quite well known that prosecution experts make much more money in the courts than defense experts,
mm, absolutely.
60% more or something. So, there's money to be made by going to court and giving evidence for the prosecution. So there's a variety of different reasons why people might have wanted to hang on to this hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, I've encountered this phenomenon of people not being able to admit that they're wrong about something. That's quite common, I think, not just among doctors. Um, so I'll just say that in the future we're going to have a talk as well, conversation about the courts. But we wanted to primarily discuss shaken baby syndrome today because there's enough to say about that. But we will definitely get into the courts at a later date, and we'll touch upon it today. But there's a lot to be said about the court system, about the selection of witnesses, and we both have a lot of thoughts on that, I think. Um, so I just wanted to ask you about there are cases where shaken baby syndrome is accepted and cited, and obviously you reject this. So what could the alternative or more credible explanations be for the kind of observable phenomena?
Well, sometimes, and we have to keep this in mind in any case, the answer may be we don't know. And you will be aware, and I'm sure many of your subscribers will, of sudden infant death syndrome, when babies are found dead in their cot. And they don't have any findings at all. They don't have any bleeding. They don't have any hemorrhages, any brain swelling, maybe a little bit. But um, we accept that sudden infant death syndrome occurs. It's a syndrome. It's recognized. We don't know the cause, but we do accept that babies die suddenly and unexpectedly in infancy. There are lots of hypotheses why this may be the case. I don't think any of them have been um, actually proven, but a lot of people are doing a lot of work on it. So we have a precedent here for a sudden death in an infant, which is not explainable. So that's one possibility. The other thing which comes up frequently is that this baby has actually had a fall, a low fall, rolled off a bed, rolled off a changing mat, dropped by a parent, tripped over by the cat, or whatever. And a low fall certainly has the potential to cause the triad. If you look at the research findings, it's likely to have more potential for causing the triad than a shaking would. So if I've been in court in cases where a parent has said they dropped the child, then I've always cited this. That's far more likely, if you want some statistics to go on, than shaking, because we know the forces aren't nearly as great in shaking as they are in dropping a baby. So low falls is one. Another one that turns up quite frequently is blood clots in the veins draining the brain. And young babies do have a tendency to form clots more easily than in older life, especially in the neonatal period. But sometimes babies have a thrombosis in a blood vessel draining the brain in the dura, and that can cause bleeding, and that can cause brain swelling, and that can cause the triad. There are various rare blood clotting disorders which can cause the baby to have hemorrhages, subdural and retinal hemorrhages. And may I say that if you get subdural hemorrhages, it's almost inevitable that retinal hemorrhages will follow. If you see retinal hemorrhages in the eyes, and this used to happen years ago before we had CT scans, if a clinician saw a baby with bleeding in the eyes, they would assume there was going to be subdural bleeding because these two go together so frequently. So blood clotting disorders, other genetic disorders, things like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome has been brought into the debate more recently. So there's a range of medical conditions, but I think the most common would be low falls and venous thrombosis, in my experience.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So as hard as this is, we know how difficult this is, but you have been successful in overturning some wrongful convictions in this area. And I watched you. In fact, before I spoke to you, I was watching you on Newsnight being interviewed, and I heard a voice, and I thought, I know that voice, and it was John Sweeney, who's obviously now doing a lot of work on the Lucy Letby case. And in this in this Newsnight item, there was the case of Suzanne Holdsworth, who was wrongly convicted, who was in prison, not just had a child taken away. Obviously, she did have a child taken away, but she was in prison. And she was very emotional about your assistance. So I just wondered if you could, reflect on the experience of that and any other wrongful convictions you might have been involved with.
Well, Suzanne Holdsworth is one that is very, very big to me, very important case in my mind. She wasn't actually the mother, she was babysitting the baby who died. And that baby had multiple injuries that weren't picked up at the initial autopsy. And at the initial autopsy, the experts came in and said, oh, this is injuries equivalent to a 60-mile-an-hour road traffic accident. Or the babysitter had beaten the child's head against the banisters and so on. All sorts of things were suggested. But Suzanne was just a caring woman. She babysat other people's babies because she adored children, absolutely loved them. And she was looking after this baby for a friend, her mother. And the baby had malformation of the brain, was born with changes in the brain, not very severe, but would have lived a reasonable life. It was prone to have epilepsy because of these changes. But he'd also had an injury where he'd damaged the roof of his one eye, and there was a fracture going through the roof of that eye, and the brain had started to push down through that hole and was displacing his eye. So his eye was pushed down. So he'd obviously had quite a severe brain injury at some time. Apparently, he fell against a fireplace. That would have given him another potential cause for having a seizure. And when he was in Suzanne's care, he had a seizure. She phoned the the ambulance service and described very clearly a baby having a seizure. But because he also had subdural hemorrhage and retinal hemorrhages in the swollen brain, she was accused of shaking him. And when we looked back over this case, when we reviewed it in the appeal court, got some experts in who know all about epilepsy, who said, yes, this would likely have caused epilepsy. And yes, what she described, what the Suzanne described, was an epileptic seizure. It sounds just like an epileptic seizure. That was a natural cause of death. And the reason this child had other markers of injury, I think there were some bruises on the head and possibly on the body. I can't quite remember now. But I think this child had a very rough upbringing. We know that he'd sometimes be left in the house on his own with a radio playing loud so that if he was crying, the neighbours wouldn't hear him. So he'd had a difficult few months of life. And poor Suzanne, who was trying her best to help, was accused of killing him. And it did her untold damage. I mean, she really suffered in her time in prison.
Absolutely. So, I mean, it's great that you're able to help her, and you work in the court system now. You think you're doing the right thing from a integrity perspective, from an intellectually honesty perspective, from a scientific perspective. You're speaking in your area of specialism, that's undeniable. Effectively, you're doing really important work, and then suddenly it appears that you start being targeted. Well, I think it's generous to describe it as appears. I think you very clearly are targeted. So I'm going to read from a 2016 BBC article that was written by John Sweeney. In 2010, Detective Inspector Colin Welsh, who has since retired, told an SBS conference, just an acronym for shaken baby syndrome, in the United States, that defense witness testimony was at the top of the list as a reason for the police losing child abuse cases in Britain. In his address to the conference held in the US state of Georgia, D.I. Welsh reportedly suggested some tactics to question everything about the defense experts. These included questions about qualifications, employment history, testimony, research papers presented by these experts, and even going to the professional expert bodies to see if we turn up anything. So what I wanted to ask you in relation to this, and you can say as much or as little as you want about this, and I'm more than happy to comment on this as well. How do you feel about a police officer being an advocate for this? And what do you think it says more broadly about the police as an institution?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. This police officer did address this meeting, and a friend of mine who is a lawyer in the United States was there, and she took notes, absolutely detailed notes of what was said. We asked the organisers of the meeting if we could have a copy of the PowerPoint, and they said no. It was an open meeting, public meeting, anybody could be there. So we asked the police, and it took me 4 years of freedom of information requests to get a copy of that lecture. And when I got it, it was redacted. Almost everything was redacted from it. But I do know that he said in that lecture as well that these experts are going into court and they're giving scientific evidence. And this is just confusing juries. So we don't want that. But he also said we might have to read some of these papers now. Before we've just put in little summaries of them, but we're going to have to read the papers. They were very anxious, the policemen involved, to maintain their rates or increase their rates of conviction because, of course, policemen get rewarded according to keeping up standards and not investigating cases that they don't end up with a conviction on, because that's very costly. So it seems absolutely reasonable that they would want to pursue their rates of conviction, but it was completely wrong what they were doing. To try and get experts out of the courts was completely wrong. They also said they would go to the judges by the back door, and they realized that the place to go was to the family court, because in the criminal courts the judges don't say very much. They might instruct the jury as to what they should and shouldn't consider, which is the important part of the evidence and so on. But in the family courts, the judge will make a judgment and will write her opinion or his opinion of the case. and give a full account of it. So if you go to the family courts, you can find that some judges were very critical, and several judges were very critical of me. Now, whether the police had got to them or not, I don't know. But it did coincide with a number of events at that time. After the police gave this lecture, I had a couple of really, really harsh judgments against me, criticisms of my, not judgments against me, in judgments, I was harshly criticised in several cases in the family division. I was reported to the Human Tissue Authority, which is the authority that oversees standards in pathology labs to make sure we're not keeping tissues we shouldn't have or doing things with the tissues that we're not allowed to, so doing research or whatever if we haven't been given permission. My colleague Marta Cohen was also reported to the, no, it was Irene Scheinberg was also reported to the Human Tissue Authority for doing research without consent. And these reports were rapidly dismissed by the Human Tissue Authority that we hadn't transgressed at all. This was just a rather malicious reporting. There was an episode of Silent Witness, which featured a female pathologist who knew all about baby brains, who had been challenged in the family division, and who had, in the story on the television, was doing research without consent. And so many of these things tick the box with my career. And then she committed suicide, and that autopsy was shown that she was also an alcoholic. So it was a pretty nasty portrayal, but it was absolutely sure that that was modelled on what had happened to me. So following that lecture, yeah, things went badly downhill. And as a result of it, I got reported to the General Medical Council, which is the doctors' governing body who give us or withhold from us our licenses to practice. What do I think of the police? Well, I have a good friend who works in the police or has worked in the police and said, you always get one or two rotten apples. And I think that's what we came across, because I don't think this is a reflection on the police as a whole necessarily. I wouldn't want to cast aspersions on the whole of the police, but I think that we had a couple of police officers here who wanted to get their promotions and get their convictions, going about it the wrong way.
Okay, well, that's very fair. So in response to that, a spokesman for the Metropolitan Police confirmed that D.I. Welsh had given the speech. We know that anyway, so they had no choice. But said it was completely committed to the judicial process and would never seek to improperly influence it. Now, I'm more than happy to comment on this. What do you think about that? Do you have any comment to make on that assertion?
Sorry, just say that again, that the
Do you want me to, do
police
you want
are
me to repeat
committed.
it? Yeah,
Yeah.
complete. This spokesman says the police or the Metropolitan Police are completely committed to the judicial process and would never seek to improperly influence it. Do you agree with that? Do you think that's entirely reasonable? If you don't want to comment, let me know and I'll comment.
Well, I think it's just a response pulled out of a drawer. This is what we say when somebody
Yeah.
says something about us. I don't know. I mean, I think there were certainly some very crooked police officers involved in our case.
Hmm.
I'm not going to extend that to the whole of the police.
No. So let me give my comment on this. When they say improperly influence, that is a very carefully chosen phrase intended to indicate that they wouldn't do anything unlawful. I think that basically the answer that you gave previously, that there's far too much of a focus, in my estimation, over the police as a body in securing convictions for the reasons that you outlined. And the fact that this gentleman, D.I. Welsh, has given this speech and he said, look, we don't want to have science in the court, it's too confusing. It means that essentially it's a very authoritarian perspective that he has. I call it soft authoritarianism, where he thinks, right, if we get a conviction, we're automatically correct because we're the police. That seems to be his outlook. Otherwise, he wouldn't be making this speech. What he should be doing is reflecting on the fact that the job of the police is to establish the truth, or it should be, the job of the police should be to establish the truth about a certain situation, not to secure a conviction that may be based on erroneous information and therefore unsafe by definition. And I want to reference something from Andrew Malkinson's case. So when Andrew Malkinson had been convicted, there was DNA evidence available. This is all in the Guardian newspaper. This is not contentious, and that was systematically withheld. And there are leaked documents from the time from Greater Manchester Police where they're saying our attitude. I'm only very slightly paraphrasing what they said because I don't have it in front of me. But basically, what they said was our attitude is we will defend our conviction. And that is basically what Cheshire Police are doing now with Lucy. And that is basically what the Metropolitan Police are doing here. We want to convict on these cases for the reasons that you've discussed. So while you can't disagree with their comment. They're obviously completely committed to the judicial process because they want to convict people. So that's essentially meaningless. And saying don't want to improperly influence it, what they mean is we won't do anything unlawful. Whether they would do anything unethical or that could be deemed unethical, or whether they would do something that would lead to unsafe convictions is a different matter entirely. And the most telling thing is they don't criticise D.I. Welsh. They don't say he shouldn't have done that, or that's not our attitude, or we don't think we should be trying to discredit witnesses, or we are concerned about the standard of science in court, or anything like that. They just say, "Oh, we're committed to the judicial process." Yeah, we know that. You try and convict people all the time. So that would be my opinion. But I think already people that are listening to this will see the same patterns in Lucy's case occurring in relation to shaken baby syndrome, undoubtedly. Um,
Mhm.
so I'll move on. So I want to discuss now. We had a bit of a chat about this before we started recording, and you've obviously been through an extremely difficult personal experience. You're a highly regarded doctor. You're obviously speaking in the courts. You're very committed to what you're doing. It's something you care about very passionately. It's very important. It's about children's well-being. And then all of a sudden you find yourself being targeted, and then you go through this very difficult time where there's tribunals, and then you're struck off for a period of time. So I wondered if you'd like to go over all of that and explain what it was like, and because I think there are even just in our quick chat beforehand, there were details that I didn't know that probably most people won't know. So could you talk about that and how it felt and what it was like?
Well, it all started in about 2006, 2007, sometime like that. And where I was working in Oxford, there were a number of paediatricians and a paediatric neurosurgeon in particular who didn't agree with me. They believed in shaken baby syndrome, and they would tease me. They'd laugh at me and say, I remember one particular case of a choking, and a baby was laid down on his back and given a bottle and left unattended and choked on the milk. And they said, "Oh, killer milk syndrome, eh?" And they would laugh at me whenever I suggested choking. Well, any parent will know that we worry about babies choking. It's one of the chief anxieties that you have when you're looking after a new baby. Um, and then one of them said to me, "Do you know what? There's talk out there that they're going to report you to the GMC because of your work on shaken baby syndrome." And I just laughed because I said, "Well, when I write a report, I write it to the same standard as I would write a scientific paper." And by that time, I'd written well over 100 scientific papers, many of them as first author. And I knew how you write a report, how you have to cite anything you say, you have to put down the reference, why you're saying that, where you get the evidence, what the scientific basis is for things that you're saying. You have to quote it all. So I did that in my reports to the court. And this surgeon just laughed at me and said, "Well, we don't understand your reports. You put all these little references in. We don't know what that's all about. But there are people out there who are wanting to get you." And I just thought, well, let them try. I'm doing my very best and I'm writing reports to the highest standard that I feel that I can. Anyway, then it went a bit further. Um, and in fact, I think what hit me was when I was involved in a case in London, in court in London, I was due to give expert evidence, and suddenly my phone rang in my office in Oxford, and the barrister who was instructing me for the defence said, "Why the hell didn't you tell me you're before the GMC?" And I said, "But I'm not. I'd been through two previous interim orders trials and they were dismissed. There was nothing to hold against me." He said, "But you are. You're going to go to a tribunal." And I said, "This is not a joke. It's not funny." And he said, "I'm not joking. The policeman in our case came into court this morning and told the judge that you and Marta Cohen are going to go before a tribunal of the General Medical Council." And I was absolutely shattered, rang the medical defence organisation I belonged to instantly. And they said, "We've got to know more about it." And of course, what happened was, because I work all day, it was the paperwork was sent to me by post, in a special delivery, and because nobody was in, they'd taken it away again. So I didn't get that letter for another couple of days. And there it was. They said, "Yes, we're going to take you to a tribunal because of the things you've been saying in court," and based it mainly or entirely at that stage on judgments in the family division, where I had been criticised for challenging the mainstream view. So then it really kicked in, and I had to get the Medical Protection Society involved. They agreed to take on my case and to support me and to support my defence. And that was in about 2010. And I finally went to court in 2016. So 6 years I was preparing for this hearing. And that was an enormous amount of time. I had to go to London almost every week, I seem to recall, to meet my legal team. They absolutely did not want to know anything about shaken baby syndrome. I said, "This is what it's about. It's all about shaken baby syndrome." They've picked out 6 cases of shaken baby syndrome to criticise me. One was in the criminal court, but the others all in the family division, with judgments from judges, 2 judges in particular. Each wrote 2 judgments, which were highly critical of me. And I said, "But I've done hundreds of cases. I've done cases where I've been on the prosecution side, where I've said, yes, this is abuse because there's fractures and bruises and all sorts of injuries. I've done cases of medical negligence. Why aren't any of those been? If I'm such a bad expert witness, why is it that those cases are not being considered? Purely shaken baby syndrome." And my legal team didn't want to learn about shaken baby syndrome. They said, "Look, you've been accused of professional misconduct. We work for people who we're defending in front of the General Medical Council. We only want to work on that." And they kept trying to narrow it down just to what I had said, the words I'd used, how I'd said them. And that was intensely frustrating. I can remember sitting around a table in the lawyer's office in London. There were 8 or so of them, a couple of barristers, a couple of solicitors, secretaries, trainees, and me. And we spent a whole day saying I had said in a report, there's absolutely no evidence of abuse in this case, because I'd read through about 8 or 9 prosecution expert reports saying this is an abuse case. And I looked at all that evidence and I said, no, there's absolutely no evidence of abuse. And the argument that day was the use of the word absolutely, because by using that word, I had lost objectivity. And therefore, the GMC would have a case to criticise me for losing objectivity because I said absolutely no evidence of trauma rather than there was no evidence of trauma. And this was in a report written 10 years previously. And it just brought me to tears because I would spend hours and hours arguing over the words I'd used in my reports. Nobody ever questioned the content of my reports. Nobody ever said your science is wrong or you've misquoted this or whatever. At that time, it was all about the way I'd said things in court. Anyway, this went on until the beginning of 2014, I think, when they had found eventually, took them 3 years to find a neuropathologist to give evidence against me. And when he was first approached, he said, "No, I can't do this because I know her, I've been in cases against her, and I'm biased." And then a couple of years later, he actually agreed to do it. I don't know why, I don't know if there was a huge financial incentive, but he agreed to be the chief expert giving evidence against me in my hearing. This is really upsetting because it was a colleague I'd worked with on many occasions, written papers with, and he turned. Um, and so then finally I had to go to the hearing. It started off in 2014. We all had to trek up to Manchester. We were up there for 2 weeks, and there was a question about the use of the judgments in this case. The GMC hadn't got permission from the judges to use family court judgments, so we all had to go away again. And then they wanted them to be redacted, so the panel couldn't see all the nasty things being said about me. And we had to go to a judicial review in the January. Then we finally went back to Manchester the following beginning of October 15, we went back. And then I had to rent a flat. I had to leave my home in Oxford. I had to stop doing my day job, um, get somebody to look after my house and my animals, and move back to Manchester for this inquiry. Now, I'm no fan of Manchester or cities in general. So thank goodness I found a little farmhouse between Manchester and Sheffield, right on the railway line. And that was my salvation. Wonderful farmer and his wife who looked after me. And I could stay there. I could get the train in the morning, go in very early, sit and read at a cafe, go to the hearing, come back in the evening, and go out for walks on the Dales. It was just so beautiful. And that was my salvation. So that was 6 months, and I was found guilty. I was told my license was suspended, and I came home. I couldn't go to work. I had all my support, no, not all my support, but a massive amount of my support came from my colleagues at work. My lab staff, my clinical colleagues were all very supportive of me, and I wasn't allowed to see them. I went into the office one day to get something, and I had a woman with a clipboard following me around, not letting me go into the department. Um, and she was very embarrassed because when I did go into the department with her by my side, I mean, my staff just came up and we were all in tears and hugging one another because we were so sad to have been separated like this. Anyway, that was a horrible period. And then in the November of 2016, I went to appeal and I got my license back. I was not allowed to give evidence in the courts for another 3 years because of various problems that the judge found with my my behaviour. But anyway, that was a long time ago. I then handed back my license. My employing authority gave me 6 more months to work and then said, right, that's it, we want you out. And that was the end of my nearly 40 years working in Oxford, looking at baby brains. It was a very unpleasant way to go. I left a whole pile of research projects that were not complete. I wasn't able to complete them because I couldn't go back and use the materials.
Yeah.
So a very sad way to end what had been an extraordinarily happy and fulfilling career.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, very sad to hear, obviously. I wanted to as well talk about the fact that you did receive support from over 250 doctors calling on the General Medical Council to reverse the decision, which of course happened. In practical terms, that didn't help you career-wise, but did you feel vindicated by that support?
It was very moving. It was wonderful. And I've got to thank colleagues such as Irene Scheinberg and Marta Cohen for actually just getting that underway, for writing to people saying, look, this is what's happening. Did you know? And people just signed on and agreed that this was the wrong thing. They shouldn't be doing this to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to talk about the kind of position of shaken baby syndrome today. So I'm going to read out a passage here. Shortly after several high-profile shaken baby convictions were overturned in Sweden, the Swedish Agency for Health Technology Assessment and Assessment of Social Service, similar to the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in the UK, published an independent review which reviewed over 3,700 published papers. The study found only very low quality evidence to support the shaking hypothesis, represented by just 2 papers, each based on confession evidence, and each categorized as having a moderate risk of bias. The majority of the SBS literature suffer from fundamental methodological problems, particularly circular reasoning and a lack of control groups. The authors concluded that there is insufficient scientific evidence to assume that an infant with the triad or any of its components must have been shaken. The paper was met with critical responses and even calls for it to be withdrawn. The authors provided comprehensive and robust rebuttals. And then in 2025, New Jersey's top court became the first in the US to prohibit prosecutors from presenting expert testimony that shaking a baby can on its own cause injuries severe enough to justify bringing child abuse charges. The diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma, excuse me, has formed the basis of thousands of criminal child abuse cases since the 1970s. It is a leading cause of child abuse related deaths in children under 5, according to the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. But the science supporting the diagnosis has come under scrutiny in recent years, with newer research showing that the injuries could have other causes. In a 6-to-1 ruling in 2 criminal cases brought against fathers accused of abusing their infant sons by shaking them, the New Jersey Supreme Court said that prosecutors couldn't present expert testimony diagnosing the syndrome in the infants because it wasn't reliable. Then there's some more about the demise of the triad still used in courts. The statement did not follow the scientific principles to formally establish medical consensus. The process described was a review between society's governing bodies and their own appointed committees without reference to external audit. One of the authors subsequently wrote, albeit low on the hierarchy of evidence-based medicine ratings, professional society consensus statements represent the highest level of medico-legal evidence. The consensus statement does not meet the standards of evidence-based medicine, yet is good enough for the court. So that passage was from a paper that you sent me. And then you also sent me a reference to a critical technical report of the American Academy of Paediatrics on abusive head trauma that's kind of critical of the shaken baby syndrome hypothesis as well. So when you hear all of that, there'll be a very simple and logical question to ask, which is, why is this still being diagnosed and used to convict people?
I mean, all the things I said before, I guess these are people who believe they're helping babies, they believe they're protecting them, and they're so entrenched in their views, they're not willing to give them up. Although, as you mentioned, there was recently in 2025 a review, a technical report from the American Academy of Pediatrics. I mean, they, over the years, every few years, they issued technical reports and policy statements, which are sort of used as the guidance for practicing pediatricians. They wrote one last year on shaken baby syndrome, and with some colleagues, we went through every single one of the 700 or something references they cited to support their views, and the vast majority suffer from the same errors in the shaken baby literature because there's no formal way of diagnosing abuse or inflicted injury or even shaken baby syndrome. The only way you can make the diagnosis is by guesswork, by saying, oh, well, because the baby has these 3 findings, it must have been shaken. Or, because the mother didn't bring the baby to hospital for care and attention within a certain period of time, she must be hiding something, she must be guilty. Or because one of the parents agreed that they did it to protect the other parent. But these confessions, which is the basis of the belief system of the people who write these papers on shaken baby syndrome, they really now have only a confessions to go on. And many of these confessions are made after a child's come to hospital, had a diagnosis, had all the brain scans, and the doctors have been to the parents and said, your baby's got injuries inside the head. The only way this could have happened is by shaking. What happened? And parents just want to help their child. They want to find out what happened. They want to find the truth. And they'll say, well, I don't know. We didn't do anything, but maybe, I mean, the baby was crying and I picked him up out of the cot rather fast and I didn't support his head on that occasion. Could that have been it? And suddenly that's confession.
Hmm.
And the best way of assessing a confession is to use confessions which are made before the diagnosis has been made. And there's only one group that I'm aware of in Sweden who've done this. And they've looked at babies where the parents come into hospital and said, look, we just shook our baby and this happened. And that way, you're more likely to get an accurate answer than parents who've been told that the baby's been shaken, and then they have to find out an excuse for it. Or very often, one parent will say, "Well, I'll say I did it so that you can keep the babies. Otherwise, we'll both have the babies taken away from us, and the babies will go and be adopted, and we'll neither of us ever see them again." So
Mm.
confessions are very, very unreliable. And
Mm.
in all sorts of areas of forensic medicine, that's been shown over and over again with DNA evidence, for example, that people will confess to things who couldn't possibly have done them
Yeah.
because DNA evidence will prove otherwise.
Yeah. I mean,
So
we've
that's the
had,
basis.
sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was going to say that's the basis for the majority of these papers, um, and it's unreliable. Now, regarding that technical report where we went through the evidence and showed that the references were mostly unreliable because they were dependent on confessions or on the circular logic of saying, well, we can't make a diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome because there's not a blood test we can do or an X-ray or whatever. So we'll diagnose shaken baby syndrome when we have a baby that's got the triad. And then they do their research and they come out at the end and say, wow, babies who've got the triad tend to have been shaken. So it's completely circular. They're putting in the information that they're then coming up with as a result at the end, and that's just not scientific.
No.
Anyway, we published our findings that the vast majority of the literature that the technical report depended on was unreliable, and we were criticized. The paper was given a critical review, but they didn't say we were wrong. They said, yes, there are problems. So even the prosecution, the pro-prosecution, pro-shaken baby people are having to admit that, yeah, our science isn't that great.
Yeah.
So I suppose we should accept that as high praise coming from somebody who's a proponent of shaken baby syndrome.
Absolutely. Has there been, a significant impact in Sweden? Obviously, they've done this research. What is the legal status of shaken baby syndrome and convictions in Sweden?
Oh, yes, back to 2014. This paper actually came out in 2016, but before then, already shaken baby syndrome had been shown to be unreliable in the criminal courts and then later in the family courts. So they don't, I think in Sweden, they don't actually run straight shaken baby syndrome cases based on the triad any longer because the triad has been shown to be unreliable.
Yeah. So we both attended an event at the Francis Crick Institute. We didn't meet at that time. Um, and we both saw a French lawyer stand up, and he was representing clients in France accused of shaken baby syndrome and presumably convicted of shaken baby syndrome in many cases. I didn't actually speak to him and find out whether they'd all been convicted or whether some of them are just facing allegations. But he said, I forget the exact number. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was over 100. He had over 100 clients. So that's pretty scary. And I tried to do some rudimentary research to find out how many of these convictions could have been secured, across Europe, across the Western world. And it's easily thousands. It's very difficult to put a precise number on it, but we're easily looking at thousands. We could be looking at over 10,000 potentially. Um, what is the future direction of this? Is science, is the actual science going to overcome the kind of legal consensus that occurs at the moment? Is it going to peter out? What do you think is going to happen going forward?
Oh, I don't know. We've had so many false hopes. I mean, in 2000, when Jenny and Geddes published her papers showing that shaken babies didn't have tearing of the nerve fibers in the brain, but they were all the pathology, the encephalopathy, the triad was due to brain swelling from a variety of causes. We thought, well, they can't run shaken baby any longer because we've got this research. But that came and went, and we continued prosecution on shaken baby syndrome. The Swedish report came out, doesn't seem to have appeared in courts as far as I can see. It's very hard to tell because most of the problems are in the family division and you can't see what's going on in the family division except by reading the very rare published judgments. And I
Hmm.
think about 5% of judgments are published. It's a very low figure, especially considering the fact that in the last few years, the family courts themselves have said they need to increase their transparency and to publish more
Absolutely.
judgments.
No,
Um,
no doubt.
so we've had many times when we thought, well, the science is here now, it can't go on.
Mm,
But it still does.
mm,
And it still goes on in this country where there's nobody left to defend these cases because since I was struck off, nobody wants to go and be an expert witness in a shaken baby case and to challenge the mainstream, as it's called, or the shaken baby hypothesis.
mm.
And so parents who are accused of shaking their babies in this country face a very rough ride because nobody wants to turn up in court and defend them. We get experts in from Sweden, from the United States, um, from various parts of the world, from Canada, to try and defend these families because in this country, people are too frightened of being criticised or losing their license.
Mm. Yeah, so quite scary, really. Um, so finally, we're going to discuss Lucy Letby case. And all I want to ask you firstly is what are your feelings about the case at this point in time?
Well, I haven't. Sorry, I'm just moving a little bit because the sun's coming around, which is lovely. Sun.
It snowed here
Um,
today, snowing heavily.
Sorry.
It snowed here today
Oh, we had some.
in Dar
Where
it's
are you?
I'm living in Derbyshire, near where you stayed.
Oh, right.
Relatively near, yeah. So yeah, it snowed pretty heavily today. I was a bit disappointed because I thought, the big coat. I thought I'd put the big coat away for this year, but apparently not. But yeah, it's pretty bad weather today.
Well, we had some hail and it's been extremely cold, but
Yeah,
now the sun's back.
well, that's good. That's good.
And
So
I've
yeah, what are
completely
your
forgotten
feelings
what your
on
question was.
what are your feelings on Lucy Letby case at this point in
Yeah.
time?
I have not been professionally involved with the Lucy Letby case at all, but I did watch the press conference, and I do know her lawyer reasonably well. And the press conference involved 14 experts looking at the pathology. And of course, I would say this, but the pathology is absolutely fundamental because that's evidence that is really important in understanding why a baby has died. And as those 14 experts, I would have faith in them. I know several of them personally. And I would think if they say that this looks like natural causes or these babies' deaths were natural causes, I would think then that's probably to be listened to.
Hmm.
I mean, the whole thing mystifies me just looking from the outside. There were so many things going wrong in that unit. There was infection from the drains. There was understaffing, looking after babies who were too young and too sick to be there. And the statistics that were provided to the court that because all these babies died when Lucy Letby was on duty really are most unreliable. So I have a horrible feeling that this might all be a horrible miscarriage of justice. And that poor, poor young woman has had her life shredded already. I mean, there's no way she's ever going to come back from this as a normal, healthy human being. Whatever happens, she's had a terrible time.
Yeah. Um, do you see many of the problems, particularly legal and court problems with shaken baby syndrome being repeated in this case?
Yes, as far as I can see, that from what I've read of the case, I don't think the defense really put up a good fight. I don't think they put forward evidence to um, to help to make this a fair hearing. I'm concerned that there was only, or the main prosecution expert was not a neonatologist, didn't understand the pathology. But again, I'm not in a position really to say very much because I haven't been personally involved. I'm just reading in from the outside.
That's fair. Um, and hopefully we're going to do another interview relatively soon, and we're going to talk about expert witnesses, the court system, and so forth. But I did just want to ask you, there are now significant issues with the three main prosecution witnesses from the Lucy Letby case. I should mention as well that they wanted to include Martin Ward-Platt, who'd already been involved in two miscarriages of justice for murder previously. So what does this say about the selection of expert witnesses for court cases generally in this country?
Well, there are very few people around willing to be expert witnesses. As I was just saying, in Jake and Baby cases, nobody wants to defend these cases. So it's probably the same in her case. There are people who just don't want to go anywhere near it because the risks are, if you challenge, this woman has been through so many hearings already, if you challenge them and you're challenging the courts, maybe you too will be found to be wrong and to be run out of the courts and run out of your career as I was. It's very worrying. So I think people are very grateful when they can find anybody to become expert witnesses. And the rigor with which they study their suitability is probably not that high.
So therefore, does it say a lot that Lucy has this panel of experts now, really highly credentialed people? It says a lot, does it not, that they're putting their reputations on the line in this case?
Yes. But I think, I mean, maybe much as I did, if you're presented with some postmortems to review and you review them and you say, well, it's clear to me that this is not inflicted injury or not murder, not this is all natural. If you've seen the evidence and you've read all the reports and you understand the pathology, of course you're going to stand up and say that because what else can you say? You've got the evidence before you. I mean, that's the way I went in, thinking I've read the scientific papers. I've been doing this for 40 years. I understand the pathology. So how could it go wrong?
Hmm.
So they're doing the same thing, and I very much hope that they'll be strong enough to stand up in the courts and try and defend her. Because
Yeah,
if they're right about the pathology, then they've got every reason to stand there and say that.
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'll leave it there for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Really privileged to have you on. And as I said, I'd like to interview you again in maybe in a couple of months to discuss the court. So much more we could still discuss. I was conscious of the fact that if we tried to discuss everything, this would have been double the length of the interview probably. So I think we'll discuss that in the future, hopefully. But yeah, I'm really grateful for you coming on, and thanks for what you've done as well in the courts. To be honest, I know it was a bit of a thankless task for you personally, but I saw Suzanne Holdsworth. That was her name, wasn't it? Suzanne.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I mean, she was very moved about the fact that she had been saved. I mean, you saved her life, really. Um, so, I'm really grateful you've done that, and hopefully one day, we'll be able to change the way the system works, and there'll be better science in court, and these horrible miscarriages of justice that occur in both the criminal and family courts can be reduced at the very least. It's been eye-opening for me to learn so much about something that I knew so little about, and I mean, I knew obviously I was probably more aware of problems of the family courts, but I had a very naive view about the way criminal proceedings worked, and I really realize now that a lot of people are naive about it, and I hope that Lucy's case, if there can be a positive silver lining from it, is that we do realize that we can't continue this way, putting stuff in court that is not scientifically founded. And then we put people away for life and take the children off them and do all kinds of stuff because of this poor evidence. So yeah, that's kind of my final thought. But yeah, thanks again for joining us, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
It's been a pleasure. Yes, I look forward to that. Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Bye now.
Bye bye.